I'm Lee Moore,
I'm Rob Moore.
and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today we have a very special guest who has contributed to our work not only because of his research, but also because he was the advisor of our Professor Roy Chan, your advisor.
So I guess this would make Professor Jones sort of like my, at least, intellectual grandfather, which is an interesting thought. Professor Andrew Jones is Louis B. Agassiz's professor, East Asian languages and cultures at the University of California, Berkeley. He is also the department chair, which means lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of things, lots of responsibilities. So, welcome, Professor Jones, to the podcast. It's really exciting to have you on.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
So to start us off, I have just a trio of questions, and they're connected. One, just as quick a background as you can give us, your background in Chinese studies. Two, what brought you to Luxun? You've written a lot about Luxun, a lot of really interesting things about Luxun, so I'd like to know that. And three, we gave you a choice of topics, and you're the one who said, hey, let's talk about Luxun's Zawen. Not the standard choice, so I'm curious about those three together.
Sure. So I wonder if there's a grandfather clause in
I think there should be.
Advisors and students and their students. Yeah, so I have been at this for a long time. I began studying Chinese literature in college as an undergraduate, went on to do my doctorate here at Berkeley, taught for a couple of years in Seattle. So that's another Pacific Northwest connection. I've done a lot of research on modern Chinese literature, but also modern Chinese music and popular music and media culture over the course of my career. But I come back in my teaching to and my writing to Luxun and translation practice also to Luxun repeatedly. I I'm not afraid or ashamed to say he remains my favorite modern Chinese writer. And that's really because of the complexity of his thought, the beauty of his language, pull and fascination of his historical situation, and the way that he wrote in ways that are neither obvious nor necessarily completely instrumental about his times and about his own life. Generally speaking, his work is just more textured and more complex, and I think more philosophically probing than most of the other writers I've encountered, which is why he deserves to be reread and rethought and restudied continually. As for Zawen, we can go into this in more detail, but even if we're looking at his work objectively, say looking at the Luxun Chenji, or the collected works of Luxun on the shelf in my office, we would immediately notice that almost 2/3 of those books are taken up by Zawen. So if you're going to cover Luxun as an intellectual, as a writer, as a thinker, in a holistic fashion, you have to pay attention to his engagement, his lifelong, almost everyday engagement with this form. But beyond that, I actually often find his Zawen just as complex, ambiguous, and aesthetically pleasing as his fiction, if not sometimes more so. And I think we need to kind of get a handle on this format in his writing.
I definitely found the selections that you put out for today fascinating. I don't think I had read any of Lucian's Zawen, so I was tickled to be able to read it. Why do you think his Zawen have been ignored in the teaching of Lucian? The focus in sort of the literature is always on Nahan and his stories. Why not more about Zawen?
I think part of that is because the teaching of Luxun has been sort of caught up in the mythology of his work as being at the sort of headwaters of modern Chinese fiction. And that word fiction sort of obscures somehow the fact that he produced in his career two slim volumes of fiction, but something like 17 volumes of Zawen. The other reason perhaps is that I think incorrectly his Zawen have often been relegated to the realm of the merely political or the merely instrumental. That is, he has a reputation of using Zawen to attack his political opponents, or cultural critics with whom he does not see eye to eye. And that's certainly the case. He can be quite caustic in some of his essays. But that's really just the tip of the iceberg, and there's a huge sort of continent of varied landscapes and topographies that we find in his writing. And Maybe on account of that diversity, it's difficult to easily characterize or easily incorporate that work into a class. And that might be a third reason.
It's interesting because my exposure to Zawen in the past was as part of a larger narrative of his career that has him writing Wild Grass at the end of the 20s.
Hmm.
And then afterwards, just sort of deciding, you know what, fiction, poetry, and all that, it's kind of done. I'm just going to kind of go with this Zawen thing and see where it takes me. The Lu Xun as a purely political figure, one of the reasons I think he is, you're right, ignored after that in particular is people tend to see the Zawen as the moment when he tunes literature out and just begins to sort of write socialism or something else like that. And it is fascinating because this entire series that Lee and I are doing is largely dedicated to this notion that when you really read Lu Xun, I mean, really read him, there's no way this narrative sticks.
Right.
It's just too complex for that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that narrative only works if you willfully ignore the extremely literary quality of his Zawen. Uh, yeah, I'll put it that way. I think if you look at these writings from the standpoint of literary form, from the standpoint of rhetoric, from the standpoint of actually quite innovative ways that he is writing himself into the print culture of the period, uh, it's certainly just as innovative as his earlier fiction.
Lu Xun has, you said yourself, he's kind of been framed as this fount of modern Chinese fiction. One of the ways he's been deployed is this nationalistic figure of Chineseness. This was something that I know that things like this could not be printed today in the PRC, and I was struck by how it was very much attacking this idea of Chineseness. There were several things that seemed to compare most Chinese adults to children. That was the Toys Zawen. It's stunning how he is attacking Chinese as an identity, right?
I suppose we could think of this as a constructive attack, but yeah, a lot of the things he says, and this is noted often by my students, wouldn't really pass the shelf and home test. They would certainly break a lot of glass hearts, as the saying goes these days. But I think we can think of it in the larger context of mm, his consistent practice of self reflection, which sometimes verges on self laceration. But when he's identified a certain type of Chineseness as being part of a colonial structure of feeling or a colonial structure of knowing, as in the essay that I pointed out to you guys, Lessons from the Least, I think he's not attacking Chineseness as an essential quality, but Chineseness as it is historically felt and practiced in the 1930s as he's writing. So it's good to make those kind of distinctions. He's trying to cut away at certain aspects of Chineseness that he feels are counterproductive. And there is certainly a rhetorical shock value in a lot of what he writes. He is trying to nahan. He's trying to make an outcry and awaken people. And in order to do that, you sometimes have to take rhetorical positions that break through common sense, or break through the sort of everyday run of opinion that you would see in the newspapers in that day, and certainly even more so in our present day.
We should get into some of the pieces that you wanted to talk about in specific. But before we do, could you tell everybody just as briefly as possible what are Zawen and how do they differ from perhaps some of the rest of Lu Xun's writings?
I think when I was sort of starting out as a graduate student and learning about Zawen, I learned a sort of restricted definition of Zawen as being politically sharp, short pieces of writing that speak to the events of the day or speak to figures of the day in often very acerbic terms. And this is actually a very strange and uh, probably incorrect definition of what Zawen are when you actually turn to the corpus and what they can be. Um, so I want to take the Chinese words at face value, right? Za means miscellaneous, random, uh, diverse, heterogeneous. So let's just say that these are short essays that can embrace lots of heterogeneous kinds of topics, materials, styles, voices, and leave it at that. I think the restrictive definition of Zawen comes in when politically at least, or at least in the sort of politics of the Chinese Revolution, when in 1941 and 1942 there's a debate in Yan'an about the proper role of the essay, and Dingling asserts that China and the party, it still needs Zawen, and she means Zawen as politically critical or even internally reflective writings that will reflect and then right wrongs within the revolutionary practice of the party. And then, of course, famously with the Yan'an Forum on Arts and Literature, Chairman Mao sort of tamps down on the idea that instead he asserts that you need unity and a unitary voice because the party and the nation is locked in a existential struggle. But I think looking back at the Zawen, not just Lu Xun Zawen, but Zawen in general of the Republican period, we can see that there's a great deal of heterogeneity and diversity. We have colophons, prefaces, reflections on everyday life, parables, random things that happen in everyday life, descriptions of urban scenes. So it really is a kind of portmanteau genre, and I think that's why I like it. The only thing that kind of links all these Darwin is that they're short and pointed.
Right before you signed on here, Lee and I were just talking briefly, and I mentioned it's fascinating reading him this time around because I'd always been led to believe there's this firm break between Wildgrass, the prose poetry of Wildgrass, this very experimental Lucian, and the Zawen. But you read enough Zawen, you realize, no. He's doing a lot of experimenting here too, and in fact, never stops experimenting from Wildgrass.
I completely agree. One of the essays that I pointed out to before we started is called Modern History, 现代史. I think if you place that essay in the middle of Wildgrass, it would not be out of place at all. It works
Absolutely
like a prose poem. And there's another kind of how should I put it, a kind of lineage for this kind of writing, which is that we know that Lu Xun for many years was fascinated with Nietzsche, and
yes,
especially with Thus Spake Zarathustra. He actually attempted his own translation, which he never published during his lifetime. And I think in both Wildgrass and some of his more philosophically inclined Zawen, you see an experimentation that with aphorism and parable that comes right out of his sort of fascination and perhaps not mimicry, but experimentation with some of Nietzsche's most distinctive philosophical forms. That is, Nietzsche thinks in parables. And I think Lu Xun has not gotten enough credit for also thinking in parables. So there's not a whole lot of difference to me between, say, 死火, Dead Fire, one of the pieces in Wildgrass, and a piece like Modern History.
And that's a great pivot point for us to start discussing some of these texts themselves. Can we look at Modern History, which I found was just this incredibly ironic text that I struggled to figure out how to deal with it?
Which is why it's great. This is why I love reading Lu Xun in general, and why his best stuff is so fantastic, because you could find yourself going, wow, that was great. And then going, wait, what? It's like reading Gogol or Samuel Beckett or someone going, that's just so profound. And I have no idea what it's talking about.
I like that you mentioned Gogol and Beckett. I also think of two celebrated critical theorists who actually write in this mode as well. One of them is Walter Benjamin, who has a collection called One Way Street, which is actually a sort of montage of encounters or sights that he saw or street signs that he read in Berlin. And he kind of elevates those quotidian encounters to the level of critical theory and philosophy. The same might be said of Theodor Adorno's Minima Moralia, which is also a collection of aphorisms and short pieces that take ephemera and elevate them to the level of highly ambiguous and highly insightful philosophical crystallizations of some kind of insight. And I feel like Lu Xun often did this, especially in the period in which he was writing for 自由谈 or Free Talk, which was a column in the Shenbao or the Shanghai News in the early 1930s.
So I'm going to come at you. Here we go. Think of me as one of your students. Okay. I'm coming at Lu Xun for the first time. You've assigned me this essay to read. I read about throughout the essay, and for the listener, the essay talks about Lu Xun is talking about what happens when there's a street magician working, and he does a couple of tricks, then goes, oh, gee, if you want to see more, someone's going to have to give me some more money. And they go, all right, fine, we'll give more money. And then he puts a kid in a box and says, oh, if anybody wants the kid out of the box, more money, etc. It keeps going. It keeps going. And he says basically that every magician has a new bag of tricks, but really that's kind of all the same thing. And you're reading, you go, that's great. Now, I'm going to read your translation. This is how it ends, right? So remember, it's called Modern History. The entire essay is about a magician. And the last sentence in the entire piece is, and it's only now that I remember I've written the title wrong. It has indeed turned into something neither dead nor alive. So I'm one of your students. Professor Jones, what the heck is going on at the end of this essay?
Right. So what the heck indeed. It is I think deliberately confusing. But as I was kind of mentioning before, he takes something that you might see every day on the streets in Shanghai, these kind of these kind of like street side spectacles were actually quite common at that time and involved a certain bag of tricks. So he takes that event and he says, well, these magicians will come, they'll extort money from the audience. The actual performance itself is quite cruel. It involves putting a child into a into a kind of confinement and then pretending to kill the child. And if you throw money, then the child is revived, right? He says something like people get, they'll throw money, they'll forget about the spectacle for a few days, and then the magician can come back and the show starts all over again. So this could be a sort of mordant, precise observation of actual street activities in Shanghai, but the title gives the game away, right? And that's why he circles back around to the title in the beginning, because he's asking you basically to put two very disparate things together. One, the everyday repetition of a sort of cruel money-making act on the streets of Shanghai, and two, the very large and very abstract notion of modern history. So here I think the last line where he says, actually, this kind of spectacle is, 不死不活. It's neither dead nor alive. Speaks both to the act itself, where you're asked to resurrect a dead child, and then the act itself is resurrected again, but it never goes away. And it asks you to link that idea to the whole idea of spectacle, right? And if we've read our Lu Xun, so if in this hypothetical class, I'm sure we've already read the preface to the Outcry.
Absolutely.
Which is one of the kind of preface to his first collection of short stories. And we realize that one of the things Lu Xun is very worried and upset about is the whole notion of meaningless spectacle, of, in that case, of a photograph or lantern slide that's taken of a Chinese spy about to be executed by Japanese soldiers on the front lines of the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. And what really upsets Lu Xun about this photograph, and he comes back to this kind of scenes of spectacle or scenes of executions again and again, is the apathy or the seemingly vacuous enjoyment that spectators take in cruelty. So I think we can definitely fit this essay into that lifelong cultural critique of a certain kind of vacuousness of spectacle. Here, specifically, it's a spectacle that relies on, capitalist regimes of exchange. So he emphasizes over and over again that at every step of this magic show, coins have to be thrown across the pavement. And he even uses an English or a transcription of the sound, huaza, to talk about, I think, the sound of the coins skipping across the pavement, but also perhaps the hurrah, huzzah, that comes along with people celebrating these kind of meaningless spectacles. And that's also very interesting to me. It reminded me of, since you mentioned contemporary Chinese internet terms with, glass hearts and all, it reminds me a little bit of the current phrase, sabi, which is it's to throw coins at people to comply their obedience in contemporary Chinese context of the what is it called 996 economy, but also of course it rhymes with shabi, which is a pejorative,
right?
insult,
Not a nice thing,
right? If you say it in a southern accent, sabi, not a nice thing at all. But I think Lu Xun is being equally critical and playful in his use of language and basically implying I think that these kind of spectacles might be applied to the spectacle of the news media in that day, the spectacle of politicians repeating the same tricks over and over to get popular support, of business people repeating the same tricks over and over again to extort money from the working classes. The kind of parabolic or allegorical possibilities are endless, and that's why it's such a fascinating piece. But what also interests me about it in the end is that Neither Dead Nor Alive is also pointing back to something quite a bit deeper. I hope I'm not giving the hypothetical student too much or too long of an
Your
answer, but
hypothetical student is actually super smart.
Unlike us.
Yeah,
hey, I take it
exactly.
seriously. Our Cal Bears are very smart, as are the students in Oregon, as I know from experience. Going back to the deeper sort of philosophical implications of this, I think Lu Xing is really interested in historiography. During the period in question, the 1920s and 30s, the tendency among most Chinese intellectuals was to believe in progressive history. That is, that modern history would describe an arc from backwardness to national power and sophistication, that the march of history was teleological, moving in one direction. And Lu Xing, I think, throws very, very cold water on that idea in this essay because he implies that modern history is neither dead nor alive, that progress is indeed not taking place at all, that instead we're sort of captured by the eternal return of meaningless spectacles and the eternal return of exploitation. And one of the things about this magic show that's particularly disturbing is that it involves the exploitation of children. This child is basically confined, threatened with violence, and then set free only to be confined once again and threatened with violence once again at the next iteration of the show, right? So there's a sense in which the enormous cultural value that was placed on children in this period is 未来的主人翁, or the masters of the future, is also undercut in a pretty effective but also thought provocative way. Yeah.
Professor Jones, can I ask, do you think that this connection with children goes? I mean, obviously there's Kwangren Ruji, the end there, save the children. Do you see any kind of arc in sort of Lu Xun's writing to this?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I actually wrote a long time ago, a book called Developmental Fairy Tales, and one of the motifs of the book was precisely the notion of childhood and children and how deeply important it was to this generation of modern Chinese intellectuals who wanted to kind of push history, remake Chinese children in order to remake the Chinese nation. So Lu Xing was part of that project. He was really deeply concerned with making a better Chinese children's literature, along with his brother Zhou Zhuoren, who was very involved in this mission. But at the same time, and characteristically for Lu Xing, he's never assured that the future will be any better than the past or the present. And as much as he sort of wants to push that boulder up the hill, he's fairly clear in his own mind, at least, that the boulder is going to roll back down. So in a lot of his portrayals of children or his calls to save the children, there's already sort of a rip tide that's pulling him back towards the shores of a more grim kind of history. So even in Ji, Diary of a Madman, the last lines are "Save the children," but you'll notice that in the original publications there's ellipses after that, dot 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 dot, which sort of take us back to the beginning of the story, in which the madman, who's also the visionary, is berated by and avoided by the local children. That he's somehow scary. How
Yeah.
do they know that, or why did they think that? Because their parents have taught them.
Hmm.
So we get into a kind of circular problem here that we can't really free children from the heavy hand of the past if indeed they're being brought into the future by the parents who have already been formed by the heavy hand of the past.
Right.
Yeah, you can see the recursive logic there. And I think Lu Xing was terrified by and very, very acutely aware of that kind of logic.
Which is a neat segue into at least two of the pieces that you suggested we look at and talk about deal with children. One is called Toys, and the other is called literally Shanghai Children. The
Right.
Toys one in particular, I found fascinating because it gets into questions of creativity. Shanghai Children has a lot to do with the actual child rearing system and sort of ethics that people use. But Toys, the theme there is, what are we giving our kids to play with? Why is everything a knockoff, a copy? We can't be creative for our children. And that's fascinating to me because typically when I've read Lu Xun in the past, when he talks about creativity and not just emulating, say, Western literatures or trying to be what you're not, it always has to do with quote unquote grown up stuff. Here, what he's saying is this goes all the way down. You can start up as high as you want to go and talk about Nietzsche, but eventually it's all connected. If we're not being creative for our children, then it doesn't really matter what else we're doing.
Right. So one thing I'd point out is how deep and persistent this kind of thinking through these problems and not necessarily solving them is in Lu Xun's work. So one earlier essay that's quite famous is "How Are We to Be Fathers Today?"
Hmm.
And there too, he's very interested in the problem of creativity and the problem of how, in his view, traditional Chinese schemes for upbringing, for raising children, uh, suppress or even destroy their sort of innate creativity. And in that essay, he proposes that uh, fathers today who want to free children to move into a brighter, more sunlit, more rational kind of cultural world can be like sacrifice themselves by holding up the sluices of darkness to allow the children to run out into the sunlight fields of modernity. That's actually a relatively cheerful essay on Richard's part. And another thing I want to say about his Zawen in general is we read them now with the name Lu Xun attached to them. Back then, that wasn't the case. He was publishing promiscuously almost every day in lots of different newspapers and journals, and almost all of these pieces were written under pen names. Um, and in fact, if we kind of follow his pen names, he has all kinds of different personae. He's a little bit like the Portuguese poet and writer Fernando Pessoa in this way. He has different personae who actually have different casts of mind and different positions on issues. That essay about how we're to be fathers today is written under the name Tang Si. And if we follow some of the other essays written by Lu Xun but using the pen name Tang Si, we'll find that Tang Si is much more optimistic than Lu Xun usually is. But if we turn to, say, the essay in question about toys by Mi Zizhang, that writer, that persona is a little less optimistic, right? So we can actually see Lu Xun kind of ventriloquizing lots of different positions in his Zawen, and that's fascinating too. So back to toys, yeah, it's a really complicated one. It was situated in a time when there was a kind of national goods movement, that is, the press and the government were trying to get people to buy Chinese goods. So often, even goods that were made abroad were labeled national goods, usually using kanji, even if they're manufactured in Japan. So he's making fun of that movement. And here, I think he's also, we mentioned before how he's very sharply critical of colonized attitudes as well. And here, I think he's making fun of the fact that local Chinese prefer foreign goods and prefer modern machine made toys and don't see the innate creativity of folk handicrafts, like the toys that he mentions in the end, that's sold by someone from Zhangbei, which is also popularly known as Subei, which is a group of rural migrants into Shanghai that were routinely dismissed and marginalized back then, and actually still today, people make fun of Subei people. So the last line of the essay is quite wonderful. His son is playing with this kind of homemade, really ingenious, locally made handicraft toy. And he says, they are, I think, far more deserving of praise than those who have brought back the latest models of weaponry purchased in the West, even though I know saying that will perhaps elicit from some quarters a disdainful or pitying sneer. And he even imagines the passerby on the street looking at his son and him playing with this local toy and kind of looking down on them, right? So he's pointing out a really interesting hypocrisy that people will trumpet the national goods movement but ignore local creativity that could be the source of, a genuinely viable local toy industry.
Can I ask? I wanted to ask about questions of nation and coloniality. So this essay, Toys, has this problem of the Sube Ren, the Jiangbei Ren, and how he's kind of trying to flip the narrative. Even though they are the lowest class, they are the ultimate in some form. I don't exactly know how to express it, but in the essay on lessons from the movies, I thought was fascinating because he talks about his childhood experience of seeing the poor, if I remember correctly, the poor being exploited, or there is this sense that ideologically the poor have to give themselves up for their richer masters, and he says that that same thing is happening in films, but in films it's a kind of black or literally racialized black or white dynamic. What's going on there?
That's exactly right. There's so much I want to say about this essay, lessons from the movies. First of all, I think there was a volume a while back that was produced called Kafka at the Movies, and we could probably write a similar essay or similar collection, Lu Xing at the Movies. He was an avid moviegoer in this period in Shanghai, and some of his most interesting cultural critiques come out of this encounter with, again, spectatorship and the spectacle of films. So this essay, I think, is really interestingly typical of his technique as a Zawen writer. He'll often seem highly digressive, and by the end, you figure out that the digression is actually the point, right? Is actually at the core of what he's trying to say. So here, he starts with a seemingly random childhood memory about watching opera in the village. And he talks about a particular opera in which a servant of a wealthy elite literati family is willing to take it for the family. That is to take the punishment that should have been visited upon the family itself. He relates how the spectators really enjoy his self-sacrifice. And of course, the implication is that this is part of a structure of power that holds the rural, dispossessed folks in their place. And then he suddenly makes kind of unmediated transition to watching films in Shanghai. He gives us the physical space of the theater, that is, that the seats for international colonial people, and then in the second class part of the cheap seats, the Chinese people watching. And what they often watch are films produced by Hollywood that pretty explicitly, I think, enforce colonial stereotypes of, say, white adventurers going to Africa and lording it over people of color in those contexts. And Lu Xing is very keen to note both how the physical arrangements of the theater and the ideological messages playing out on the screen mirror each other in quite uncanny ways. But the key part of the essay, I think, is, and it's rather beautifully written, is he's talking about Hollywood films, and the passage goes, when the white hero goes adventuring in Africa, there's usually a loyal black servant who will clear the way for him, minister to his needs, fight fiercely for him, and die in his place so that the master may return safely home. And as he prepares to set out on his next adventure, the master recalls the dead man. A loyal servant is hard to find, after all. And a shadow flits across his feature, the black face in his memory flickering across the screen and across the yellow faces of the audience in the faint light of the theater. A shadow passes as well. They have been moved. So the irony here is, of course, a structure of identification whereby the Chinese audiences identify not with the black servant, but actually with the white master, right? And feel that same sort of patronizing pity for the servant who's died for the master, right? And of course, the parallel then becomes very clear with the earlier indigenous opera piece. And I think what's wonderful about this is it's not merely, the critique is not unidirectional. The critique is omnidirectional. He's attacking both what he sees as the invidious oppression of traditional rural life, as well as the colonial world order, and making a connection between them. And of course, he ends the essay by saying, of course, we can't lord it over other people, so now our local film industry is producing films about ethnic minorities on the southwest borders of the country so that we can also have that feeling. It's both brilliant and also prescient.
What makes Lu Xun's writing so rewarding is that like any truly great comedian talking about current events, he gives it to everybody, right? So he's not just saying, "Yeah, these freaking Westerners, if we could just get rid of them."
Hmm.
There's a little bit of that, but there's also a little bit of the, yeah, no, it's got to go both directions here, and that willingness to really critique everything is just fascinating.
Yeah, that's really what I appreciate about his practice as a writer and really his ethics, right? That he's never willing to see one side of the issue. He's never content to, only turn his animus on others. He's also very, very clear about the need to critique oneself.
And we need to start kind of wrapping this up in a second. I mean,
Sure.
geez, we could talk about these Zawen for hours. Maybe we should at some point. I wanted to throw this question out there because you mentioned early on in the discussion, Thus Spake Zarathustra by Nietzsche. I happen somewhat coincidentally to be reading that right now. But what's fascinating with that, when you read Nietzsche's aphorisms, and specifically Thus Spake Zarathustra, it's not always clear where Nietzsche ends and Zarathustra begins, and vice versa. Like if you just read him as a one-to-one, you're going to miss a lot because, of course, Nietzsche dreamed up Zarathustra not as him, but as kind of the perfect counterpart. Like if I was going to sit down and talk philosophy with one person, it would be this guy I'm going to create here. So
Right.
when we read these Zawen, Lucian has all these different personae. Was he trying to do something similar, or are we reading the quote unquote real Lu Xun when we read these?
I would say that for me, one of the enduring fascinations of these, there's not a singular voice in these Zawen, and often Lu Xing will begin by quoting another text or taking on someone else's voice and then turning on a dime to ironize, critique, or um, expound upon that other voice or that other text. So I kind of feel like his essays are a patchwork of different voices that he um, pits against each other in really, really productive ways. So even in the passage we just read, he kind of ventriloquizes the voice of the white master, but also the Chinese spectators by saying, "A loyal servant is hard to find after all," right? This really isn't Roshun's voice.
Right.
It's the voice that he's imagining and projecting into the piece, but it's highly effective because it brings us into that mindset and then out of it so that we can look at it critically from the outside. So I think he's a master ventriloquist.
As we are starting to wrap up, one of the things that I had talked about in a different episode in this series, Rob, is Lucian should really be seen in terms of sort of the discourse of global modernity, that or global modernism. Professor Jones, do you agree or disagree with that statement? And why has he been placed in this box of specifically area studies folks? Why is he not taught as a part of the broader canon in dialogue with European modernism?
Yeah, I could not agree more strongly and passionately with that point. Um, yeah, it's a complex issue of why he hasn't sort of attained to the sort of status of those kind of authors that been mentioning, actually quite intentionally to put him in their company today, like Kafka, Benjamin, Adorno, um, Nietzsche, and others, because I think he's every bit their peer in his very painful, complex, paradoxical grappling with the dilemmas of modernity. And he's certainly also their equal in terms of literary innovation. I think one problem perhaps is the relative unavailability of good translations of his work. That's a problem that I hope this volume, John Days Under Lamplight, that was edited by Eileen Chang and Kirk Denton, will go some way to remedy. Another problem is the sort of discourse that was very famously argued about a number of years back, for instance, whereby Frederick Jameson made the claim that third world writers are necessarily uh, speaking in terms of national allegory. Of course, that thesis got a great deal of pushback, and I don't want to rehearse the whole argument, but whether intentionally or not, Jameson sort of entrapped writers like Lu Xing in the important but also relatively narrow parameters of the experience of being colonized. Whereas I think if we look carefully at the question, colonial modernity is something that is shared by uh, James Joyce and Franz Kafka and all many of the kind of luminaries of modernist writing. Yeah, and I do hope that we can bring Lu Xun into conversation with that larger current of thought and with those writers.
Let's call it that. I want to remind the listener, though, about this volume. We mentioned it twice so far. I'm going to mention it a third time. Jottings Under Lamplight. Great translations in here. There are a couple other volumes dealing with his fiction. If you are interested in Lu Xun, I highly recommend getting this as well. And it's like Professor Jones said, this represents the majority of his writing. This is what he mostly did. So if you're hoping to understand him as a writer, you need something like this to work with. And I'm still the hypothetical student, so I'm hoping to get an A by plugging something my professor translated.
I think that's a great place to end it. Professor Jones, thank you so much for being a guest on our podcast. It's been a fascinating class in the hypothetical classroom.
Agreed.
This was a lot of fun. And I appreciate the work you guys do as well to bring modern Chinese literature to the masses. Not just modern, but Chinese literature to the masses.
To the masses in multiple senses. I think that's a great place to end it, Rob. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.